Year 4 of 6-year grant. They wish now that we would have done this sooner, but praise be to them, we did it. They said, we don't have it right, we know we don't have it right. So we did all the participatory evaluation. We included family caregivers, as well as the supervisors, the directors, and myself. We looked through the previous year's cases. There were 31 that had been open in the previous year, and we examined them in the following areas. We were able, through this process and the adjustments to the implementation, to change the organization, which was highly bureaucratic, very similar to what you just heard about Kansas City. A mismatch between all of the implementation drivers and the wraparound model. We were able to change the culture of the organization by changing the implementation drivers. So we looked at 31 cases in these 5 or 6 different bullet point areas, looking for patterns of implementation. Prior to looking at the case data, everybody on that evaluation team read the monographs developed by the National Wraparound Initiative that tried to clarify the principles, the phases and activities, the theory of change of wraparound. That's something that the NWI has produced between 2004 and 2008. So everyone was on the same page, having read those monographs. To give you a sense of how challenging the population was they were working with, blue is nationally on these grants, and these are percentages. You can see that nationally they're serving a much less diverse population than Houston, which is in purple. Presenting problems reported, again, national in blue, and Houston's kids, adjustment disorders, conduct delinquency, hyperactivity, attention disorders, school performance, depression, all much, much worse than nationally. So very challenging population. In going through the cases, we eventually developed concurrence between the participatory evaluation teams. That we had 6 cases out of 31 where there was model fidelity. Teams were well composed, extended family natural supports were engaged. They were doing contextual assessments, not just focused in one area of family life, and multi-system interventions. They achieved goals in a step-by-step manner that actually addressed the problem behaviors, the behaviors of concern. 70% or so of the cases that we looked at now look much more like case management. And this is a trend in wraparound. If you don't have fidelity, it winds up looking like case management. Teams were limited to in these cases, to the female caregiver and the youth. Well, that's all you got on your team from the family, your assessment's going to be limited. Your design of interventions is going to be less creative and more limited. Your identification and use of strengths as the basis of those interventions is going to be more limited. This was a big one, the second bullet. When there was clearly family conflict in the case data, they didn't have the people who were part of that conflict engaged on the team. So how could they possibly work on the conflict that was contributing to the use behavior of concern? A step parent at odds with the biological parent, for example, over monitoring, guiding, nurturing, and disciplining. And when juvenile probation or child welfare should have been involved, they weren't involved, even though legally they were involved. Their assessments in these non-fidelity cases address basic needs, but not the behaviors of concern. Goals and interventions were infrequently revised. They were not behaviorally specific. You could have the same intervention lasting for 6 months where there was non-fidelity, just like case management. Therapy. Yeah, every month, yeah. They were using remarkably similar formal services. The strengths that they identified as the basis for these interventions were primarily desire to have a service or a pie in the sky. I'd like to see my kid doing this, as opposed to, no, your kid right now is smoking dope, not coming home on time, etc., etc., etc. So we then said, well, why do we have a lack of fidelity? And I walked them through the implementation drivers. What about staff selection? Turned out there are many changes of grant leadership, Each change of grant leadership had different hiring criteria. The there was no model pertinent hiring criteria. Job descriptions resembled case manager descriptions. They basically pulled them, boilerplate, out of the proposed Child Protective Services system for the grant. The positions were not clearly differentiated. In wraparound, you've got a parent who's been through the system, called a family partner, working with the facilitator who develops the wraparound team. Their job descriptions were very similar. And not that much difference between them and the supervisors, honestly. Supervisors had no experience coaching staff development. Training. They had different trainers brought in by different administrators. Theoretically, it was all the same training on wraparound values, principles, etc., but it gets occurred a different way. There was no consistent training. The value-based training said, we don't talk about problem behaviors, we talk about unmet needs, and that helped the drift away from focusing on behaviors of concern. This is the perception of the family caregivers, the supervisors, and the director. And there was no training for supervisors. Coaching, they had no basis for evaluating model pertinent knowledge and skills. It was basically an ad hoc risk containment focus, as we saw in Kansas City. Performance assessment, all of the fidelity data required in these grants was aggregate format. You could not case by case evaluate to what extent are we really doing strengths-based interventions? To what extent are wraparound teams well composed? There wasn't a data basis for evaluating that case by case. They pulled their data system from the child welfare system, so it tracked number of contacts, time of contact, a couple of bullet points on what the contact was about, but it really didn't say much about what it takes to make a wraparound team effective. The exploration of the problem. They would handwrite needs assessments and strengths assessments. There was no systematic way of gathering that information and evaluating it from a coaching perspective. So we talked more about, 5 minutes, I can move fast. We talked with the administration about what can you do to change this. And one of the things they said is, well, they've got too many cases based on what I've learned about this model. And they reduced from 20 to about 8, the average caseload. They changed so that the care coordinators and care partners were under the supervision of the same person. The previous organization administrator had it bureaucratically organized, much as in child welfare. Your job description is this, so you're supervised by the parent partner supervisor, or you're supervised by the wraparound facilitator supervisor. But they work together on the same team, so we had to change that. They agreed to do that. We clarified job descriptions, etc. Jump ahead a bit here. And we brought in theory-based revisions to training and integrated them with data forms that would reflect whether or not staff understood and were applying what the training said. And this came out of some previous work on NIDRR grants, what makes an effective team. We brought that in, and we brought in from MST fit circle assessment using timelines and fit circles, and you'll see an example of that in a second. Because of the nature of the population that they were serving, MST assessment would probably keep them more ecologically focused. We developed a coaching manual for how to coach through the new data forms. We introduced the data forms and revised coaching formats in the training. The formats were going to be group learning formats as well as individual coaching formats based on what the data said. Here's some examples of changes to the data forms. This is literally taken off the top of the form. It reinforces some of the concepts that were taught from those NIDR studies about what makes an effective team. I don't have enough time to go into each detail on this. But specific to that, we taught them, and this may be useful to some of your work, teamwork, we taught them that the team has to have overall goals that they agree on, that are behaviorally specific, related to the behavior of concern, and that the team has to have agreements in 4 areas. What information do they need? How do they share it? How do they make decisions when they don't agree? how do they resolve conflicts? Because the NIDER study said when this is in place, you have a basis for collaboration and assessment. So our coaching began to be focused on team composition as well as team structure in this manner, using the data forms. Show you the problem fit circle. This is straight out of MST. Staff thought the families would hate it. 2 minutes left. The families, in fact, love this because it's big and strong pictures. Arrows indicate what contributes to any one of the elements that are supporting contributing factors to the behavior of concern. So the family could actually draw it out. And I think this happens, I'm working longer hours, his grandma does the guidance and discipline different, the teacher does it different. We think all of this is part of the problem. And then what we taught them to do was pick this apart and design step-by-step interventions, as much as MST does, to change a contributing factor outside the center circle through your intervention. And then redraw your fit circle if the behavior is still continuing. And gradually, step-by-step, you will eventually eliminate the behavior concern in the middle. Taught them to do the same thing with achievement fit circles, and they transferred data from their fit circles to strengths forms and constraint data forms. Again, all of this goes to the coach, came to me as an implementation consultant, and went to the administrators on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. The planning form was designed to reinforce exactly what I just described for how you design your interventions, which took it into step-by-step, and we were eventually able to get interventions that lasted less than 6 weeks, as opposed to the previous 3 to 6 months. So we built in continuous quality improvement. Data model improvement goes to consultation on implementation. We look for patterns of staff confidence development. We adjust the coaching based on that through consultation on site and then sometimes through Skype consultation. Staff would apply it, new data would come in. Let me quickly show you some of the outcomes. Here are the fidelity outcomes. This is a year to 18 months after that process of changing the organization to a data-informed, model-permanent organization. Again, blue is before the change in Houston, purple is after. Fidelity is 70 or above, high fidelity is 80 or above. Below 70, you don't have wraparound. Gray is the national mean. So you can see that, and this is each of the wraparound principles, that on each of the principles, Houston went from below the national mean to above the national mean, often significantly, not tested significance, in terms of fidelity. Quick look at some outcomes. National on the left, Houston on the right. You can see that they had much more difficult kids, lots of suspensions and expulsions. Look at the change from intake to 6 months in 2011, which is when we were doing this data-informed coaching and consultation. Much more improvement in outcomes. There is a lot more I can say, but I'm out of time. Questions? Is there time for that?
Yeah, maybe a couple minutes.
Couple of minutes, questions.
Any questions? I have a question. Hi. Thanks for ending with an example of success story. I think that helps us all a little bit better. I think you brought up a really good point about, this has to be a multi-pronged process of educating field instructors, educating our students. But I think something really critical that you brought up that I'd like for us to talk more about, and I would love to hear from practitioners about this, is the funding agencies. If they're not required to demonstrate outcome improvement or fidelity or anything, I know if I was working in the field and seeing how busy I've seen people be in the field, that I would be hard pressed to take on the extra burden of being true to whatever outcomes I'm supposed to prove. So I'm wondering, when we're talking about bridging the gap, how research and practice could come together to make a concerted effort make change from the top down while we're also working so hard in the middle and on the ground to make change.
That came up in the process of those 12, 18 months of trying to create the change. We had a lot of pushback at first. I mean, and frankly, the coaching was the first point that we had to spend most of our time on, because even though they had a manual, they weren't working from the manual. They did what they did before. So we had to really ride them until they got it. What they eventually learned, they have to have an administration that's going to hold you to this, that believes in this. What they eventually learned is that we're spending less time on these cases, even though it seemed initially like we're going to be spending more time with all this data. And I'm actually learning more, and I feel better about what I'm doing, and I understand better what I'm doing, and I'm seeing things change as a result of what I'm doing. It's a process. When you look at the wall, it looks like this at first, but as you begin climbing up that wall, piece by piece, step by step, you realize, oh, this isn't that bad. There's a handle here, there's another one there. I can, build from this point and then go to the next point, piece by piece, step by step. It requires an administration and working with somebody who understands the implementation and importance of these constructs to just hold their feet to the fire for a little bit of time for them to learn that it really isn't that much more work. How much time do you really spend chasing your tail? Hot case to hot case. Never feeling like anything is ever changing. It's always the same thing. How do we want to spend our lives? Are we really being effective? So you need people in leadership positions who are going to champion that, encourage people to stick to it. Great question.
Any more questions? Join me in thanking